All right, welcome back. We're going to get into part two on chapter 21, World War II now. Talking a little bit about what kind of America does to get ready for war. And it's really important because a lot of the things that we kind of do for the first time to get ready to fight in the First World War are kind of the same practices that we're going to use and learn lessons from this experience to mobilize quickly and get America ready for the Second World War, when that comes, 20 or so years later. So anyway, we'll jump right to it. All right, so again, it's 1916, and I show you this map because I want you to see that there is a pretty good bit of dissent politically during this time. So Wilson's popularity as president, isn't overwhelming. In the election of 1916, people vote pretty much along party lines and regional lines. And it's a fairly close election. Imagine it would have been something similar to this had the Republican vote not split in 1912. So just to have an idea that we're back over 60% voting, but numbers are still down from how they had been in earlier elections, 80 plus percent. So this would be the last election, presidential election that didn't include women. So all right, so let's talk a little bit about America's process of getting ready for war. We never had to get ready for war quite this way before because we had never been in a war that required such immediate, big, and involved industrial production very quickly. We weren't super industrialized at the time of the Civil War and obviously before that. And then, the industrial power that existed at that time was much more unbalanced between North and South. And it didn't require that much mobilization on our part to get ready for the Spanish-American War. So here we are now getting dragged into this conflict in Europe, into this First World War. So first thing we have to do is ready an economy for war. And you haven't seen that, nor have I, in our lifetimes, fortunately. But back then, in the early 20th century and really up through World War II, the economy really has to organize and prepare for war, unlike the way we would today. Meaning, different things exist to kind of push a nation and get them ready for the coming conflict, or the conflict that in this case already exists. So a couple ways we do this. One thing you have to do is raise money. One thing we do very well in the First World War and later in the Second World War is raise money through bonds. Now, a bond is basically somebody sells a bond to the government, and you get a certificate for $100, $1,000, whatever, that you can turn in in 20 years or however long the length of that bond is. You can return that for your money back eventually with interest. Okay, if it's a 20-year bond, then you can cash it in before the 20 years, but there'd be a penalty for it. It's basically like putting your money in like a savings account, for an extended period of time. The government takes this money and then uses it to, whatever it needs to do for the war effort. We raise over $20 billion in Liberty bonds for World War I between 1917 and 1920. So that's a lot of money that we get together that people buy into bonds for, right? And you could still buy bonds today. They're around. So this is kind of a new, not a totally new concept, but a new concept to be used for military purposes. Basically, in a sense, almost privately funding the war effort to a certain degree. Right? But there's pluses for it for those that do that. Another thing that we do now is something called the War Industries Board. Okay, And now I don't like the way the book kind of explains this. The War Industries Board was led by a man by the name of Bernard Baruch, who's a pretty important figure in our countries. It's not Renard, it's Bernard, which now looks worse, but whatever. So Bernard Baruch is the leader of this War Industries Board. And like I said before, I don't like the way the book kind of explains this. So the War Industries Board is basically the group that oversees production for the war effort. And what is the government doing here for the first time? The government is doing something called nationalizing industry. Okay? And what that means is if I'm the government, if I'm Bernard Baruch, I could go to Henry Ford, which he did, and other automakers and say, I need you to start making engines for planes, or I need you to start making tanks for the war effort, or cars specifically for that, or I need you to use the assembly line to start producing guns and ammunitions for the war. That is nationalizing America's industry for a war effort. It's an emergency situation. It's where the government steps in and kind of, they can't really force somebody's private business to do that sort of thing, but you can't, like I said, you can't really force them to do that, but you can really strongly encourage them, and they're not going to say no, because if you do that, nobody's going to buy from you anymore because you look unpatriotic and bad. We do the same thing in World War II to make tanks, to make planes, to do all this stuff. You nationalize the textile industry to make clothing for soldiers. You nationalize some of our food production to make food rations to take to the soldiers overseas. Okay, so this is the first time we've seen kind of a government takeover of businesses, to produce and create for the war effort. So that's kind of a new thing. The other thing we have to do is find a way to create a sense of unity in the country, especially regarding a war that there's going to be a lot of division on. Remember, just a year before, Woodrow Wilson got elected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Now, less than a year later, we're now in the war. So you're going to have to find a way to create social unity. One way to do this is through the Committee on Public Information, led by a guy by the name of George Creel. Now, the Committee on Public Information produced information, newspaper stories and pleas. Most importantly, posters and propaganda posters and things that reminded people and encouraged them to support the war effort. These would be things like you have Lady Liberty here draped in the American flag, Uncle Sam and the famous "I Want You" for U.S. Army first comes around during World War I, and many other propaganda images and posters to encourage American people to buy bonds, encourage American people to help with the war effort, and also reminding them constantly who the enemy was, saying bad things about the Germans or whatever. These reinforcing messages are really important and helpful in the war effort, and they would be extremely helpful when we get to the Second World War. And a lot of the people that found success in creating these posters and images and propagandizing for the war after the war in the 1920s find great success as marketing and advertising executives in New York City and other places around the country. So you see the war creates another outlet for careers for people when we head into the 1920s, which we'll talk about that a little bit more next chapter. But if you're trying to sell people on a war, it's going to be pretty easy later on to sell them a pair of pants, right? Other ways we try to create social unity is by legislating them. Okay, and now we had once before the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams, and if you remember way back when, chapter 6, how how unpopular those were, you would have to imagine that these would be unpopular as well. Basically, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were meant to limit and root out spying and um, espionage and negative remarks about the war in America. Okay, they want to root out any espionage going on. We're particularly concerned about this because, espionage and spying. That's basically what espionage is. Are things that were becoming a bigger issue for the first time during the Second World War, or I'm sorry, during the First World War. And sedition is basically if you say anything bad about the country or government, could be considered sedition. So we come up with these laws because we're really in a tough time. We're in a bind with with the war and what's going on, and these would be laws that would face a lot of scrutiny, just like the ones did when John Adams was president. And ultimately, most notably, they result in the famous Supreme Court case, Schenck versus United States, which we're going to call super important AP point number 24. So Schenck versus the United States is the story of this guy named Charles Schenck, who produced anti-war propaganda during the First World War and was arrested for sedition for producing these anti-war pamphlets. Schenck went all the way to the Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court upheld the ruling, in this case because it's a time of war, so national unity in a time of conflict like this is of the utmost importance. This is where they came up with the famous, yell fire in a crowded theater, and how that is in a sense a similar, like a seditious act in the sense that the result, is what's going to happen because there's going to be a stampede of people and people are going to be hurt. So that's what they kind of mean with that. The language that they use specifically is, especially during wartime, it is legal to do anything that poses what they call a clear and present danger to the safety and sovereignty of the United States and her people. So acts that speak up against the war during a time, or speak up against the war during a time of war, pose what they would call a clear and present danger to America and her people. So that's Schenck versus the United States. This war, the organization effort for it and everything, turns out at the end of the day goes pretty well and helps us helps us in the long run. So, all right, here's a few images of some propaganda. Here you have one about saving canned food for the war effort, so people can take or they can send it over to Europe. Obviously, Uncle Sam here and up here, and then you've got one about saving sugar and molasses for something else to be used for the war effort, right? When they say "can the Kaiser," that whole thing is the Kaiser is the leader of Germany, so it's a plan works to get rid of him. A lot of these same types of stories and things would be used in the images and messages would be used in the Second World War against both Germany and the Japanese. All right. So the war, of course, once America gets involved in the war ends fairly swiftly. Now, it's not because we entered the war that we ended it, or that the war ended because we were suddenly involved. And it's like a team where, you've been beating up on each other for 3 quarters, and then all of a sudden you're in the 4th quarter, and you bring out 5 new studs that haven't played all day. They're fresher, they're ready to go, and they're going to tip the scales. So America doesn't win the war, but we certainly help end it when we did, because France and England and Germany, for the most part, were beating the crap out of each other for 3 years. And then we enter the war in 1917, but don't actually get there until January 1918. American soldiers don't see any real action until April of 1918, and by November that year, the war is over. They start seeing serious action that summer, and by November 11th, Germany's had enough, and that's the end of the war. Now comes the big challenge of creating the peace afterward. And when you're dealing with these guys, especially this one, he's not even looking at Woodrow Wilson when he's talking to him. That's Vittorio Orlando. He was the Italian leader. But we'll talk about that in a second. So anyway, so what do we do to establish the peace after the war? Okay. So they meet in France, in Versailles, and ultimately it results in the Treaty of Versailles. But the Treaty of Versailles is largely based on what's called the 14 points. And this was Woodrow Wilson's plan for peace and unity in the future of Europe. This is why I say Woodrow Wilson is one of, if not our most significant foreign policy president in our country's history, because he really takes the lead with proposing and creating what the terms are going to be for Germany and Austria-Hungary, but mostly Germany after the war. And it's going to be a difficult thing because, the British and the French, they've been through a lot over these 4 years, and they're very, very angry with Germany. So the prospect of not really punishing Germany for the war effort isn't something that the other Allied countries are really all that interested in. Okay, so Wilson's got his work cut out for him. The 14 points mostly deals with new countries, new borders and territories that will be created. And out of the 14 points, we get the new nations of Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Austria, and Hungary are split into two separate countries. And there's one other one, and I can't think of it, so whatever. Anyway, so you get all these new countries, borders being shifted and things like that, and there's the discussion of what to do about rules for Germany after the war. Wilson pushed for kind of a more kinder, less harsh penalty for Germany, which he did at least talk the other leaders out of having Kaiser Wilhelm executed. But he wouldn't talk. He couldn't talk them down much from really wanting to penalize Germany for the war. Okay, but the most important thing, of course, out of, at least in the mind of Wilson, out of this agreement, the Treaty of Versailles, was the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was the final point to the 14 points. And basically, this was the dream of Woodrow Wilson, to create a body of countries that can come together to find diplomatic ways to create peace after conflict or to avoid conflict. And Wilson wants nothing more than to create this League of Nations and have the United States, be a leading member of it. Wilson sees this as an opportunity for the United States to really take a lead position in the world, but it's all not to be. Begrudgingly, these other countries ultimately agree to the League of Nations only after war reparations that amount to $56 billion are placed on Germany. So finally, all these nations agree to join and become part of the League of Nations. And most ironically, the one country that doesn't join the League of Nations, of course, is the United States. So let's talk about why that didn't happen. So the reason the United States doesn't join the League of Nations is mostly because of this guy, who we'll talk about here in a second. But there's a lot of other factors involved too. Number one, a lot of American people remember immigrants came over from Europe, don't feel the need to be involved with that part of the world. Number two, American people have seen how horribly the European people have torn themselves apart and killed each other for 4 years. Why do we want to have any sort of involvement with those people at all? There's also the fear of communism and growing socialism, because they've seen Russia fall by now to communism. So Russia by 1918, is now a communist country, and that scares the heck out of a lot of Americans. So what we do is kind of back away from the rest of the world and go into a state of what we call isolationism. That's basically where we don't want to be involved with the rest of the world. So that's a big part of the resistance to the League of Nations. But the other big part of it has to do, like I said before, with this guy, Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge was was a congressman. He was the Nancy Pelosi to, Woodrow Wilson's Donald Trump. He was his adversary Republican leader in Congress, and basically came up with a list of what he called his 14 reservations, which were a list of reservations that had to be met in order for the United States, or in order for the House and Senate to agree to the United States joining the League of Nations. And they basically mostly were about kind of what rights America had in the League. In other words, it kind of gave America a little bit more power and freedom in the League of Nations to kind of get involved with what it wanted to, not get involved with other things. Wilson knew that if he was going to acquiesce, if he was going to back off and accept that, then the League of Nations would fail completely because all the other countries would be upset. Henry Cabot Lodge probably knew that too, and knew Wilson would never back down. Anyway, it's a long, tough process, and Wilson responds to these reservations by traveling the country all over the place, giving multiple speeches every day, trying to convince people of why it's important for the United States and why it would be good for the United States to be part of this League of Nations. Wilson goes all over the country, gives all kinds of speeches, works himself to exhaustion and illness from which he never recovered. And ultimately, it came down to a vote in the Senate, and Wilson was unwilling to bend on any of his provisions for the League of Nations. Like, he wouldn't compromise on anything, and ultimately the United States doesn't join, making the League of Nations a much weaker organization, because we created it theoretically, but then we're not part of it, right? It's like it's like building something yourself and then not enjoying it, right? Or it's like a head coach getting all the players on a team and then going coaching somewhere else, right? But his unwillingness to compromise probably doomed the League of Nations. Probably doomed the League of Nations from the start, and it wouldn't be an effective body. Certainly, it was a rough draft for the United Nations, which has proved much more viable. But anyway, this probably kills Woodrow Wilson, literally and figuratively, as his health, because he worked himself so much to exhaustion trying to get people behind the League of Nations that it ultimately probably led to his death and demise. But that's kind of what happened here. Our unwillingness to compromise, or his unwillingness to compromise. Senate votes down the League of Nations. The United States doesn't join. So That's it for this video. We got a little bit more that I'll send out tomorrow or Wednesday, and we'll see you next time.